Chapter 6. 7 years later. Basil raced out the kitchen door of the Nightingale pub.
"Come back tomorrow, Arvo, lovey,"
bellowed Mrs. Clancy, trailing Basil to the kitchen door and poking her head out onto the back alleyway.
"We should have us another loan waiting for you, my lad."
Basil turned over his shoulder, watching her blonde curls bounce around her wrinkled, grinning face.
"Thanks, Mrs. Clancy,"
he said, shooting her a smile that would break 1,000 hearts.
"And the fish and chips were delicious."
"Any time, lovey, any time."
Hurling a sackful of clanking bottles over his shoulder, Basil strolled down the damp alleyway feeling happy. He glanced up into the amber rays of an autumn sun slipping through the wispy evening skies, feeling the cool fresh air on his skin, a subtle reminder that winter was nearing. Wiping the corners of his mouth, a content feeling swept over him, thinking about how lucky he was that old Mrs. Clancy fed him good, hearty meals. Mrs. Clancy loved Basil. It was hard not to, really, for Basil had grown into one of those courteous young men who would be glad to do a favor. Mrs. Clancy was struck down with the Spanish flu a year or so ago, and the Nightingale pub was short-staffed. Basil, whom just happened to be walking by with a bag of bottles, caught the flustered staff having a cigarette.
"You give us a hand in the kitchen, young chap, and you can take all the bottles you fancy,"
one of the staffers offered. Not believing his luck, Basil did whatever was asked and more, washing the dishes, oiling the kitchen floor, or sometimes just peeling potatoes and chopping the vegetables. By the time Mrs. Clancy was well enough to return to the Nightingale, none of the staff wanted Basil to leave, and neither did Mrs. Clancy. She shared many a colourful tale of her life with Basil, and they enjoyed each other's company. And as promised, he was given huge amounts of bottles, in return, slinging them over his burly shoulders in his Hessian sack, down to the glass yards, in exchange for sterling. Luckily, the study was only a hop away from the Nightingale, but some nights it felt like miles, thanks to the hefty load of glass clunk he managed to carry.
"Well, good evening to you there, young Basil, my lad,"
Mr. Dooley cheerily said, puffing away on his brown pipe, closing up the yards.
"Evening, Mr. Dooley,"
Basil panted breathlessly, rolling the heavy sack off his shoulders and thumping it onto the ground.
I'm sorry I'm later than usual tonight. The load was lagging me. Not a fuss, my lad, not a fuss,"
Mr. Dooley dismissed quickly, the last tinge of sun reflecting on his robust, bearded cheeks.
"Every time I'm seeing you, I feel me britches getting shorter and you're growing taller. You must be drinking the good stuff."
He chuckled heartedly, the smoke pillowing from his nostrils into his nicotine-stained beard.
"So then, what treasures you bring for me this evening, eh?"
Just the regular, Mr. Dooley.
"No metals?"
Mr. Dooley asked, wobbling his stout frame toward the wooden crates.
Not tonight. Mrs. Clancy says to say hello."
A blushing smile ran over Mr. Dooley's face.
"She be a good old lass, that Myrtle Clancy, she?"
"Yeah, well, she cooked me a fine fish and chips," grinned Basil, quickly sorting his glass into the crates.
"I no be doubting her. I'm going home to me Rosie cooking a juicy roast lamb with the gravies and mash and peas."
He nodded, rubbing his hefty waistline.
You know, me Rosie's never been short of asking about you these days,"
he said, furrowing a brow.
"Perhaps one night you'd like to come to the house for dinner."
Oh, thanks. Thank you, that would be nice," stammered Basil. But truth be told, he was cringing inside. Rosie, Mr. Dooley's beloved daughter, had met Basil at the glass yards one evening a while ago and insisted Basil should take her out. And being the polite young man that he was, he did. It was the worst 4 hours of his life. and so the thought of being with her again was grueling. She was pushy and loud, and had a terrible shrieking laugh that made him want to run out of town. He was not by any means in a rush to be seeing her again anytime soon.
Let's see then. Tonight it's 1 penny and 2 shillings.
Mr. Dooley concluded, fumbling for the coin in his worn blue trouser pocket.
Thank you, Mr. Dooley. I'll be sure to come by tomorrow with more for you, and not so tardy this time.
Basil reassured with a grin.
All right then, me lad.
Mr. Dooley patted him on the back, placing the gold coin into Basil's calloused hands.
Evening to you. Good evening.
Basil tipped his head and strolled out the yards. Walking through the front door of the study, Basil collapsed onto the Persian carpet beside the fire and began to slowly unlace his boots. For the past 7 years, not even a mouse would have known that Basil had been clandestinely living within the walls of this grand old study. No one, except for the O'Mittenthorpes, of course.
Good evening, Clarence,
he hollered, his voice echoing over the French plaster ceilings. Silence. This was a custom Basil honoured every night. He even had a glass half full of tawny port left on the late professor's favourite map-inlaid writing desk. Naturally, no one else was physically in the study with Basil, although on the odd occasion he did suspect an odd presence lurking around. Sometimes he would see one of the thousands of books lining the walls suddenly drop from the bookshelf, or other times he would hear footsteps creaking along the floorboards when he slept upstairs. One night in particular, Basil was snugged up beside the crackling fire, reading about the great Sultan Salahuddin, when suddenly the whiskey flask beside him fell over right in front of his astonished eyes. And many a time he had been plagued by the strange dreams of an old thin man sitting in the study, surrounded with scrolls of maps, puffing on a pipe under a dim kerosene lantern. This alone was enough for Basil to conclude that the dead professor was still very much alive in spirit. And to be quite honest, instead of spooking Basil, it gave him a sense of comfort, for it took the sting out of the loneliness he sometimes found himself enveloped within.
Old Gramps would have been proud of you, Baz,
Maud would often comment. And it was true. Basil kept the study in immaculate condition, and he tried his best to preserve Professor O'Mittenthorpe's legacy. He dusted cobwebs from the busts and bookshelves, he oiled the floorboards, and he even scrubbed and washed all the Persian rugs scattered around the study. A hunk of wood cracked over the sintering coals. Basil got up and walked around the study, lighting all the kerosene lamps, and after, flopped himself onto the old Chesterfield sofa in his socks, accompanied with a generous flask of whiskey, beginning to get into the diary of the great Italian explorer Belzoni once again. He was reading the part when Belzoni first succumbed to the majesty of the Temple of Tantira, and being so overwhelmed by such opulence, Belzoni crumbled to his knees. And the more of Belzoni's words Basil read, the more he was reminded of a serendipitous encounter that occurred a couple of years ago, dusting a wall fresco within the study. It was an encounter of when a painting by Giotto suddenly dropped to the floorboards beside Basil's feet. Startled, he immediately thought the exquisite painting was all but destroyed. Yet what shocked him even more was the rusted iron safe that had been tucked away behind it. Insatiable curiosity got the better of him, and eventually he pried it open in the wee hours of that cold night, and what lay within it for an age was breathtaking, to say the least. Plonked at the back end of the safe were bundles and bundles of sterling, swimming within several slabs of gold bullion. So the very next morning, Basil gave it all to a very stunned Maud, in which Maud then passed it on to his mother, Lucy. The O'Mittenthorpes split the loot with Maud's parents purchasing a large farm in Devon and his Uncle Jem purchasing the other, right next door. Together, they established a lucrative farming business of healthy flocks of fatted Cheviot sheep, and they would forever remain in debt to Basil. Smiling as he remembered, Basil closed Belzoni's book and walked over to the Giotto painting. He gently removed it from the wall and peered inside the safe again, feeling himself swell with pride, glancing at a big glass jar of sterling and the lone gold nugget he kept right next to it, given to him all those years ago, on that fateful night from Maud's mother, Lucy. Slowly but surely, that big jar of sterling had matured wonderfully over the years. Basil learned to be frugal early on, and even now, only bought the bare necessities like bread, new trousers, or bigger boots. He was also never one to sit back and wait for the world to find him. He had flourished into an enthusiastically curious, yet charming young man, and despite never returning to school, he had acquired an incredible education through the reading of the thousands of books littering the study. Hours upon hours of reading allowed for the periphery of his reality to expand, inviting him into a delightfully colorful world, one that he was eager to explore, to travel amongst, and to seek the answers to. In fact, he had already made plans. He had decided, almost a year ago to the day, that he was going to embark on a journey. As a young boy, Basil had often overheard his father talking of a brother he had that was a convicted felon and was sent to Australia to serve his time in prison. Basil had the crazy idea that if he travelled to Australia and found the uncle whom he had never known or never met, then maybe, just maybe, he could find out about his own life, about his mother, and the whereabouts of the rest of his family. Yet, as much as the thought of knowing a blood relative greatly excited him, he was concerned that perhaps his felon uncle was just as wickedly twisted as his father. At least in Basil's mind, he thought he could handle himself should he be greeted with trouble. He could pack a punch, to put it mildly, and had grown into a strong, strapping young man. Seldom was there anything he feared, and he dearly hoped that Maud would join him on the journey. The Grand Adriatic was en route to Australia in a few months' time, and Basil decided he would tell Maud of his plans the next time he saw him. And besides, the journey would only be for a couple of months. Later that night, just before the witching hour, Basil lay drearily in the steaming bathtub as per usual. He would lay for hours, soaking and steaming after coming up with the ingenious idea of pulling up some floorboards from under the tub to fit a tidy little fire pit at the end of it. It was one of his best ideas, he decided, with his quaint little side table consisting of his whiskey flask, a pot of black tea, a book of some sort, and on most occasions, a cob loaf smothered in jam. This was his ultimate favorite time of day, and he savored every moment, soaking his bones in deep contemplation. He moaned with pleasure, slipping into the melting tub. This time he was lost within the romance of Plato's The Symposium, but he was tired tonight, and very quietly his eyes slowly rolled into the back of his head, and he fell into a gentle sleep, dropping the book onto his bath towel.
What there?
Startled, Basil jumped out of the bath like a jack-in-a-box when a large leather-bound book thudded hard against the floorboards. Suspiciously, he squinted toward the far end of the study through the flickering kerosene light.
Clarence?
He asked out aloud.
Is that you popping into Big Good Evening?
On edge, he quickly pulled himself out of the hot water and wrapped the towel around his waist. Despite standing beside the warm, crackling fire, a sudden rush of cold air swiftly moved past his moistened body.
Oh,
He shuddered uncomfortably.
What the hell was that?
He glanced over his shoulder at the front door.
It's totally bolted shut.
Basil knew the eerie draft was much too close to him to be coming from the front door. Out of nowhere, a spark of light in the corner of his eye caught his attention. He gasped, noticing a beautifully fragile, iridescent orb floating gently through the study. Mouth agape, Basil stood frozen, unable to move a muscle as it weaved playfully through the myriads of bookshelves. It then made a sharp turn and darted up toward the ceiling rosettes. And before he had a chance to absorb this strange paranormal experience, it lazily drifted down in front of him and hovered for a moment, seemingly watching him.
What are you?
Basil whispered, utterly mystified as the steam left his shoulders. With the temptation too great, he poked his finger into the orb, only for the orb to dash across to the statue of David. Without losing sight of it, Basil ran after it until he saw it melt through the floorboards.
Oh, bloody hell!
He cried with fright. Whipping his head over his shoulder, he saw yet another large, ancient-looking book, fallen from the bookshelf at the far end of the study, plonked right beside the other book on the floorboards.
Oh, now this is just getting bloody ridiculous.
He sputtered dubiously. Admittedly, Basil was spooked. Sometimes things around the study would go bump in the night, or on the very odd occasion, he would find a book on the floorboards, but nothing as aggressive as this. He looked around for the orb again. It was nowhere to be seen. He dropped his towel and swiftly clambered his cold body into some long johns, deciding it was time to investigate. Kneeling down to retrieve the books, he noticed something peculiar from the corner of his eye. Right beside him were 12 nails pulled from the floorboards, positioned in a perfectly round circle. He stared and stared at the circle of nails, trying to make sense of what he was seeing.
What? What does this mean?
He whispered, perplexed, wiping his moist hair from his face.
I must be bloody losing my mind, just like Maud says.
Eventually, he very delicately lifted one of the corners of the floorboard. Surprisingly, noticed flat copper beneath it. Gasping, with wide gleaming eyes, he pondered for a few moments until curiosity took him over. With a wildly thumping heart, he got onto his knees and pulled away the floorboards to reveal a copper trapdoor.
Oh, well, I'll be sodded,
he exclaimed excitedly. He tried twisting the door handle, but it wouldn't budge.
Oh, come on!
He gritted through his teeth. And after some time, Basil stood to his feet frustrated, when that cheeky little orb flew right in front of his face again.
Ah!
He yelled out, toppling over, stubbing his toe in the process.
Oh, God!
He grabbed at his big toe and watched the blood ooze from under his toenail.
Oh, bloody hell!
Breathing hard, he turned and glanced at the trapdoor again, pausing to collect himself for several moments, until he finally rolled over and tried pulling it open again. He gave it one big yank, and to his utter amazement, it lifted. He quickly sat up, listening to the trapdoor's squeaking hinges, revealing to him nothing but a dank darkness. Pebbles rattled down on what appeared to be a rickety old staircase, but the darkness down there was suffocating. Grabbing a lantern from a nearby mantel, Basil shone it down onto the blackness and indeed glimpsed an old wooden staircase, looking like it was going to fall apart at any moment. But what was more peculiar to him was the pleasant smell filling the air around the entrance. He gently closed his eyes, inhaling deeply.
Oh, amazing,
he whispered, a smile forming across his lips, Never had he wafted a more delicately beautiful aroma in his life, and now the temptation to explore where this aroma was coming from became far too great. He had to go down there. Wasting no time, Basil carefully stepped down the stairs, but what he didn't see was the sharp piece of timber sticking out of the wall.
Ah!
As it pierced the palm of his hand, and he clumsily dropped the lantern down the stairs, watching in horror as the amber flames leaped out from the glass. Visions of the study burning to the ground almost gave Basil heart palpitations.
Oh no!
He panicked, listening to a sharp, sintering noise engulf the stagnant air. Yet thankfully, he quickly noticed that the flames were uniformly moving along the walls of this strange place, eventually outlining a large rectangular chamber.
What?
Basil's jaw hit the ground. The brightly lit chamber divulged a treasure haven, clumps of ancient scrolls, bronze urns, and Egyptian relics. It was as if he had stepped back into ancient times. He wondered what else Maud's grandfather was up to, besides exploring.
Fairy tales.
He gasped to himself disbelievingly.
This can only be fairy tales.
Carefully following the warm line of fervent flames, Basil wandered down the stairs, checking over his shoulder every other second, just to make sure he had a quick escape, should he need one. And as much as he was on edge, he was equally in total awe, glancing around from left to right, up and down, in every direction. But what particularly caught his eye was an altar made of petrified wood back on the eastern wall. As he felt the cool dirt stick to his feet, he saw that it had something small on top of it, glinting in the flames, realizing soon enough that it was a medallion that oddly seemed to emanate a dull glow. He glanced at the burnished bronze urns beside the altar, thinking the glow came from them.
Oh, come on.
He muttered dismissively, peering closer.
Can't be.
But as he leaned over it, shading out the surrounding light, he did see that the center stone of the medallion, an iridescent white color, was, in fact, generating its own internal light. Basil couldn't believe it.
Oh, come on, this is bloody ridiculous.
He spat in disbelief. Fighting against his own rationality, he took the medallion between his fingers, and suddenly all the flames within the chamber soared up to the ceiling for an instant.
Whoa!
Unnerved, Basil took a few steps back, and the medallion commanded his attention once more. He glanced down at the strange ancient script spiraling from the center, the fragile serpentine necklace caressing the skin of his fingers, the pinkish white stone pulsing very softly, as if it were breathing.
What language are you?
He frowned, studying the script closely. Flipping it over, he glanced at the tiny black shards of glass-like stone, positioned in odd patterns. There seemed to be something missing next to the big stone, as he spotted a hole. Squeezing it between his fingers as he was about to put the medallion back, an enormous sense of well-being suddenly flooded over him, and he couldn't help but smile.
Wow!
He snickered to himself.
Oh, bloody hell!
Despite the medallion's rather dull appearance, Basil decided it was a special necklace and was going to keep it. And just as he was about to turn on his toes back upstairs, he was sure he noticed movement reflecting on the urn beside him. He quickly glimpsed at it for a moment and saw a reflection of an old bearded man with dark sunken eyes.
Oh!
Basil spun over his shoulder, but not a soul was in sight. He felt the blood drain from his face and decided it was time to leave. A sudden thump from upstairs frightened the life out of him, and he swiftly realized the trapdoor had slammed shut.
Oh, shit!
He cried in a panic. He impatiently slung the necklace around his neck and stumbled back up the rackety stairs, twisting the handle of the trapdoor. It didn't budge.
Ah!
He shouted through his clenched jaw, thumping the door with the back of his shoulders. He hit it so hard, he knew he would definitely wake up with bruises in the morning.
Come on!
He screamed, thumping and thumping himself desperately against the door, shouting in frustration with every blow his shoulders took. He glanced down at the angry flames around the chamber, sucking the oxygen from the air. At last, the trapdoor flung open and smacked hard against the wooden floorboards. Exhausted and feeling sick to his stomach, Basil rolled out coughing and panting.
Oh.
Fumbling with his aching arms, he slammed the trapdoor shut and hurriedly scattered the wooden planks back over it. He then slumped against a bookshelf, holding his head in his hands, desperately searching for breath.
Jesus Christ!
He whispered to himself, flopping back onto the books, wondering what on earth just happened.